I'm David Berlin, Editor-in-Chief of Programmable Web, here with the 7th of an 11-part video series on APIs 101. Now this is a really great series for those of you who are looking to get smart about APIs, to be able to hold a conversation with anybody else who's talking about either providing them or consuming them as developers or the API economy. We don't do a really deep dive on APIs, but we do pretty deep stuff, and it will give you a beginner to intermediate level understanding of APIs. If you haven't viewed the previous 6 parts already, I strongly encourage you to go back and start there, because each part kind of builds on the knowledge that we gain in the previous parts. So just to review where we've been and what we're doing, we're talking about what exactly APIs are and how they work. We're also talking about why you should invest in an API program if you haven't already, how to productize APIs, in other words, how to think of your API as a product, how to secure APIs, because APIs are these things that you put on a network, and when you put them on a network, hackers love to hack away at them. So you need to secure them because they not only contribute to the security of your organization's network, they also contribute to internet security in the event that they are on the internet. Then we're going to talk a little bit about API first design. That's coming up in one of the future segments of this series. What that methodology is all about and why it's so important to go with API first to guarantee that developers will love what you give them in the form of an API. And lastly, we'll put our hands on some APIs, we'll create them, and we'll show you what it's like to consume them. So let's get on with the 7th part of the series, first by reviewing some of the content from before. First of all, APIs are user interfaces. That's the way I like to talk about them. They're just for different types of users. We're all used to using the user interface of our computers, our smartphones, our tablets. Well, computers like to talk to computers too, only through a different kind of interface. Not an end user interface, but an application programming interface, or an API, and this is typically done over a network. Now we used the wall socket and Legos and cargo containers as really cool metaphors for describing modern day things that we see around us all the time that are a lot like APIs. We talked about the contract of an API that makes it possible for APIs for an API consumer to talk to an API provider very easily. That same sort of contract exists in those metaphors we were talking about. The wall socket with 120 volts of AC, the Lego with very specific measurements on the nubs on the different pieces of Lego, and the twist lock points on different cargo containers. We talked about how this contract and this idea of APIs enables the idea of digital transformation. It makes it possible for companies that are tied down by these large monolithic infrastructures to break those infrastructures apart and spread their wings and move faster, drive innovation, and take cost out of everything that they're doing. And then how all of this activity, all these companies that are starting to embrace APIs are now proliferating them across the network in a way that forms what we call the API economy. And then in the last segment, we talked about different types of APIs, specifically the ones that Programmable Web tracks and how we classify them. We went into some little detail on what we mean by a browser API, a web internet API, an aggregate API. We broke that down for you. So in this series, we're going to talk about why you should invest in an API program. And at Programmable Web, we like to break this down into 4 major buckets. There are a lot of reasons to do APIs, but they generally all fall into one of 4 major buckets. 1, how can APIs improve my engineering? 2, how can they drive our business? 3, how APIs can be government compelled? And finally, 4, how can APIs improve the better of mankind? This is very important because there are people who are doing this. There's some examples out there. We'll talk about them in a little bit. So first, let's talk about how APIs can make engineering much better. Your IT infrastructure, all of your developers, your architects. Remember, if we go back to one of the previous segments of this series, we talked about this big monolithic behemoth, a lot of patchwork quilt technology overlapping each other, tightly intertwined, very difficult to spot the seams where one thing ends and the next one begins. And so one of the best things about breaking up that monolithic infrastructure into a bunch of services is you end up with this idea of efficient reusability, right? You can take one service and it could represent thousands of lines of code, but if you package it up between a one-line API, now everybody else in your organization can use that same functionality by engaging that one line of code. They don't need to rewrite 1,000 lines of code. Or in the event of using a public API, for example, if you had internally some form of a mapping capability developed, now you can just rip that out completely and replace it with something like Google Maps with 1 or 2 lines of code. Much easier. This idea of reusability makes it much easier for developers to move fast when building their applications, as opposed to having to write tons of fresh code, right? So that's that 1 versus 10,000 lines of code idea. Cost savings. Well, just by virtue of reusing an API over and over and over again, you're saving money because you don't have developers across your organization developing redundant versions of that same capability. So you get a huge cost savings, and again, when you take the advantages of the flexibility that's introduced by APIs and their contracts, you can also drive cost out that way because you can take out an IBM mainframe and replace it with a Linux server in a way that if the contract stays the same, the contract that we spoke of earlier in our series, the API consumers, the web apps, the mobile apps, the server apps, won't know or care. The contract is consistent, the provider of the contract may have changed, it may be cheaper, and you get to drive some cost out. Finally, agility. Once you start using one line of code or needing one line of code to get some functionality into some software as opposed to 10,000 lines of code, you can imagine you can move a lot faster. If you scale that idea across an organization where developers are just all moving faster, building software faster, suddenly the organization as a whole can technologically move much more quickly in its competitive market. Why is this important? Well, time to market is absolutely critical these days. You want to be the fastest to market with whatever functionality you have to deliver. You want to beat your competitors to market. Agility is absolutely key. Flexibility is another big issue when it comes to improving the engineering of your organization. You want to know that you can write software in any language. Well, one thing we haven't talked about so far in this series is how APIs enable that. When you have your consumers completely decoupled from your providers, one of the things that enables is you can write the consumption software, the consumption code in any language you want, so long as it's able to read the contract of the API. This makes it possible for organizations to develop their software in whatever language they think is appropriate. So that's one important issue. Another one is scalability. We talked a little bit about that when we touched on microservices, but APIs give you that ability to change out the infrastructure that's behind them in a way that can scale. So for example, let's say you have an API that's based on some single server environment, doesn't scale real well, but doesn't have a lot of users, and suddenly a bunch of developers discover it and they start to use that. Well, because of APIs, as we said earlier, you can replace whatever the infrastructure is behind that API with something that's more powerful, more scalable. As long as the contract stays the same, the consumers of the API won't care or know. And so this is why suddenly you can change over from a not so scalable environment to a very scalable one without disrupting everything, without disrupting the works. And of course, performance, same thing. You can drive just more performance. If the transactions aren't happening fast enough, well, you can fix that problem too, just by replacing the gear that's underneath the API. So simplification, of course, is one of the other key issues in engineering. Once you start putting APIs across your organization, chances are you'll start to make some standards around those APIs. For example, there'll be a standard way of specifying an address or a standard way of specifying a payment or doing currency conversion. And as you start to discover these patterns and reuse them across your APIs, you end up with very predictable APIs, very simple APIs that developers will know when they go to access it, it'll be such a repeatable pattern that it'll make it a lot easier for them to consume it. So you get this overall simplification of everything that just makes you even more nimble, more fast, driving further cost out in a way that benefits the organization overall. Mergers and acquisitions is actually kind of an interesting aspect of the API world. If you are looking at a company that happens to have built itself on an API-led architecture, then acquiring them and assimilating that architecture into your IT is a lot easier because it's all service-based already, right? And the same thing is true is if you are very much services oriented, then it makes it a lot easier to acquire another company, even if they're not, because then the work that has to be done is not nearly as much as if both companies were running giant monoliths that were impossible to integrate with one another. When you bring in a company that may have a little bit of a monolith, at least they can start connecting up to the services that you've established in your company. So it works both ways. So mergers and acquisitions definitely eases the pain, APIs ease the technological pain of doing that. Okay, now what about the next big bucket? We just talked about engineering, let's talk about driving business objectives. Okay, so one business objective is just, again, agility and cost savings. We talked about that with engineering. Engineering is also always being mindful of costs, but the chief financial officer is also looking at the bottom line. And at the end of the day, most of your engineering reasons are actually business reasons. We just break them out because it makes it easier to discuss them. But when you're driving all that cost out, that is hitting the bottom line in a way that drives the profitability of your business. And who doesn't want a more profitable business? And who doesn't want to be first to market with great new functionality? Also, it drives innovation. So you can, for example, build newer, cleaner, better products for your customers faster than the competitors can. And so you can be much more innovative when you have these APIs in place. APIs typically inspire developers to come up with all kinds of crazy ways to use them. Crazy innovative ways, that is. And sometimes those innovations will actually turn into products that your customers appreciate. It's much harder to drive that kind of innovation when there's no clear way to access the functionality within your infrastructure, like with an API. If it's a monolithic infrastructure, very overlapped, very intertwined, developers have almost no way of building some sort of cool new innovative application around the capability that's embedded somewhere in that monolith. Driving additional revenue channels. We talked a little bit earlier about the idea of large sets of unknown developers, or LSUDs, versus small sets of known developers, SSKDs. Well, many companies will use their APIs to create partnerships with other companies. A good example of this would be certain companies like Walgreens using a company like Cardio, using their API to attract a company like Cardio that makes things like Fitbits. They're fitness bands, not the Fitbit ones, but they're made by a company called Cardio, and they consume the loyalty card API of Walgreens so that when somebody engages in an activity that registers on the fitness band, it adds points to their loyalty program. That's a partnership between Walgreens and Cardio, and in the end, it's good for customer loyalty. This is a business objective. Mobile applications. Everybody wants to build mobile apps for their customers. APIs make it a lot easier to build and roll those mobile apps out faster, test them, get them into the market, see what works, come back, fix it. Without that, when you're directly integrating your mobile front end to your back end, those direct ties make it a lot harder to move quickly. Integrations. You might be creating a new integration with in your supply chain that makes the supply chain move faster in a way that drives further revenue. There are all sorts of stories around building integrations with your ecosystem in a way that makes that ecosystem more efficient, thereby driving more revenue or driving cost out. Now, just earlier I mentioned, with Walgreens and Cardio, how do you drive customer engagement? That's a really good example of it. APIs help also to provide a 360-degree customer view. If you have one API that's powering both a mobile application and a web application, and your customers are accessing your services through both their mobile apps and their web on their desktop, then you start to develop a much easier 360-degree view of those customers, where you've got them online with you all the time. You're monitoring their capability. Amazon's a really good example of this, right? I use the Amazon application on my smartphone, but I also use their web application on my desktop. Amazon, because of that, has a really great 360-degree view of what it is I like to buy, what I'm searching for, and essentially my purchasing habits. Okay, going on, more business objectives. You have plenty of companies that have taken an API and made that their sole purpose in life. Good example would be Twilio, Stripe, Nexmo, Alchemy. Alchemy API is a good example of a company that made APIs their only offering, and because they drove so much value out of those APIs, IBM came along and acquired them and made them part of their Watson portfolio of APIs. Marketing their business. When you put an API out there and you make it an open API, it creates a perception among the entire market, and especially among developers, that you're an open company. And everybody loves open companies. You may not be that open, but the fact that you have an API out there actually creates a perception of being open to working with other people. And so market perception sometimes is more important than market reality. Putting APIs out there is not a bad idea to create that perception. It also is an alternative channel for branding. So if you, for example, look at where Google Maps are embedded in different applications, you will see right on the Google map that's embedded in the application the Google brand, the Google logo. Well, every time somebody sees the Google logo on a map inside somebody else's application, that's helping to reinforce the Google brand. Sometimes you just have to do APIs to survive in an ecosystem. For example, the medical community, the electronic healthcare record community, they are coming up with a variety of APIs that are going to allow the different solutions in that industry to interact with each other and integrate with each other. Well, if you don't join that bandwagon, if you don't provide APIs as well, you may wake up one morning and find yourself to be the odd guy out. Do you want to wake up one morning and find yourself to be the odd guy out? No way, right? So you have to pay attention to what's going on in your industry to make sure that you survive in your market and that suddenly the whole market didn't organize against you in a way that marginalizes your position. One thing that APIs do is they help win customers over who are looking for a service, right? And customers like the idea of being able to switch. Everybody wants to know that they can switch at any point in time. And when you offer an API, developers know, well, if I at some point become dissatisfied with that API, let's say I'm using Box and I become dissatisfied with it, I can substitute Dropbox. Now, the actual API call, the contract between those two APIs is different, so you have to rewrite some code, right? But customers like knowing that they can make a substitution like that. The reality is, though, it ends up being a benefit from a lock-in perspective. Now, I don't really like anything that locks you in. But when developers build code, they are very loath to rewrite that code. So in many cases, when you take your company and you turn it into a platform, you take what you offer and turn it into a platform by making it available through an API, and then somebody takes that API and embeds it in their application, the likelihood of them taking it out is very low. Now, if you're charging money for that API, well, that means that you're going to have a lot of recurring revenue from that one customer. And if you take that customer and you multiply it times 10 or 1,000 or 1,000,000, now you're talking about some serious revenue, some very predictable revenue streams over a long period of time. Recruiting. APIs are often used as a recruiting mechanism because if you're looking for developers that might be great developers to bring on board into your company, you might discover them through the APIs that you publish and the developers that start using those APIs. So a lot of companies actually use APIs to recruit new developers into their companies to help go build the new innovative applications that they need to offer to their developers. And sometimes on the M&A front, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but this is a little bit different, APIs are the channel through which you might acquire an entire team when you acquire a company that's built something already that uses your API. This has happened time and time again where some new company is founded on the basis of what they do with an API, and then the API provider says, wow, that's such a cool application, we need to be selling that to our customers, and they just buy the company outright. And as we said earlier, the idea of promoting a microservices culture throughout the organization. When you start using APIs everywhere, it starts to catch on like wildfire, it goes pretty viral, and suddenly the entire company is thinking in terms of APIs, and that can only do really great things for your company. The third area is whether or not the API is government compelled. This is the third major bucket. And there are 5 ways that governments compel APIs. I'll just cover them really briefly. One is the government will standardize on some API in a particular industry and then require everybody in that industry to comply with it. So in Europe, for example, we have the PSD2 standard for banking, and all of the different banks over there are going to be forced to comply with that PSD2 standard so that customers can easily move their banking data from one bank to another. That's where the government is requiring compliance. they could encourage compliance. It's a little bit different than requiring it. A good example of this is the Green Button Alliance here in the US. The government developed a standard API for energy companies to monitor the usage of electricity at the residential and business level. The Green Button Alliance built these great APIs, and some energy companies use them, some don't, but more are getting on board with it. So that's an example of where the government is compelling the usage of an API. Or the government might encourage an entire industry to get together and solve certain problems. This is what happened in the healthcare industry. The government didn't come up with its own APIs and say, hey, you guys should either embrace this or we're going to require you by way of regulation to do it. But they may have encouraged the industry for the better of the citizenry of in this case of the United States to build some APIs and some means of integrating the different electronic healthcare record systems in a way that patient data moves more seamlessly between systems. Then they may compel different organizations to open up their data for the better of citizen efficacy. So a good example of this would be opening up the parking data in all the different lots that are in a municipality in a way that now it's much easier for people to find a parking spot and know how to get there relatively quickly. Like if you build a mapping API to get to that spot into some application, this can ease traffic. This can make people much happier because they're getting to work on time. There's all sorts of good reasons to do things of this nature. You've heard maybe about the term smart cities. So governments will often compel both public and private organizations to participate in these sorts of programs. And finally, governments compel their own agencies to open up their data. This is happening here in the United States right now. Most government agencies are opening up their data through APIs because the data ultimately belongs to the people, right? It doesn't belong to the government, it belongs to the people of the United States of America. And so the current effort is underway across the US government, all the different agencies, whether it's the Coast Guard or the Census Bureau, congressional records, doesn't matter. They're all making an effort to make their records publicly available through APIs so that developers can go and build applications that consume that information. Now the fourth and final major bucket of reasons to do APIs is my favorite one. It's for the greater good of mankind. And the best example I have of this is happening in Southeast Asia, where you have a lot of people, large populations of people who get stricken by these big storms, and a lot of people die every time it happens. At some point, the different telephone carriers got together, the mobile carriers got together down there, and they said, hey, what if we take our tower data and we pull it into a database in a way that we can see how populations of people are moving during a natural disaster and figure out what to do about it so that we can save lives, right? So there's no business objective here. There's no engineering objective here, right? There's no government compelled objective here. This is the carrier suddenly realizing they have data that can save lives. So this is a really great example of where a bunch of companies in one industry get together, pull their data, use APIs to pull that data, and discover new information, large patterns that are emerging from that data in a way that they can corral people who might be moving to some place where there's a flood to some other place where there's dry land. And we see another example of that where Joe Biden is asking all of the different cancer research companies to open up their databases in a way that if you have a larger pool of data, you might be able to spot patterns that point to some cure for cancer that wasn't easily spotted before. So that's just another example of something that can be done with APIs, of all the different companies that have that data expose it through APIs in a way that it's more easily pooled. So that's it for the greater good of mankind. Now next, we're going to go to part 8 of our series, and we're going to talk about how to productize APIs. This is really important because most organizations will often say, oh, let's just go ahead and try an API out and see what happens. No. You got to treat your APIs like products because they have a life cycle. There's a lot of work that goes into launching them in a way that guarantees their success. They just have to be treated like products. Why would you do anything else? Thanks very much. I'll see you in part 8.